Well, hello everyone, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity today to talk to you about a new idea of a quite unconventional application of immersive technologies in the field of intergroup conflict resolution. Okay, so when I talk about conflict resolution, I'm not speaking about the political path to resolving conflicts or economic, legal, and so on, which is of course also very important. I'm speaking specifically about the psychological approach to conflict resolution. So we know that virtual reality, for example, has a long tradition in clinical psychology, right? To resolve our, let's say, inner conflict, to overcome phobia, anxieties, post-traumatic stress disorders. And I started in a couple of years once I encountered power of virtual reality for psychological transformations. I was wondering whether we could also apply that to overcome the psychological barriers that we have in intergroup conflict. So speaking about conflicts between nations or cultures, regions, and quite naturally, as I moved to Israel, where I recently founded the Virtual Reality Lab for Conflict Research, so studying this potential was a quite natural thing to do in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So actually, a lot of the research that I'm presenting today has been done in this context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I believe the findings that we have that illustrate the immense potential of virtual reality for peace-building and conflict resolution can hopefully also be applied in other conflict areas around the world. Okay, so I would like to focus in this talk on perspective taking as an important, maybe the key ingredient in psychological approaches to peace building. So what is perspective taking? Peace Nobel Prize winner Barack Obama once said in one of his speeches that learning to stand in somebody else's shoes and to see through their eyes, that's how peace begins. And so we really need to think of perspective taking as a very basic first step towards peace, right? The ability to actually understand the other side in a conflict, which can then lead to a more peaceful resolution of conflicts. And speaking in terms of the psychological processes behind it, so perspective taking is really the ability or the process of imagining the world from another person's point of view, as illustrated here in this cartoon. And perspective taking, so imagining the situation of the other, trying to understand what the other side is going through, to understand the other side in a conflict, is also a cognitive form of empathy, right? As soon as I understand the other side, I can also empathize with them, which has also been found in other research studies that empathy is actually closely related and also to pro-social attitudes and behaviors, right? So once I empathize with the others, I'm also more willing and open for pro-social or peace-promoting behaviors. But the problem is, I mean, we all know that perspective taking and understanding each other's sides is important, but it's extremely difficult to implement perspective taking in the context of violent long-term conflicts. Why? Because first of all, perspective taking is a demanding cognitive effort and it requires ability and motivation. It's not something that happens naturally, right? I need to be, first of all, able to understand the other side and also be motivated to do that. And in fact, especially in violent conflicts, people are in fact motivated not to take the other side's perspective. And there has also been really research showing that being required or requested to try to understand the other side and put yourself in the shoes of the other could even backfire and have negative consequences. So it could activate all kinds of negative emotions and stereotypes I have about the other side. So now the question is, how can we use virtual reality to maybe help people understanding the perspective, the side of the other in such a context of violent intergroup conflict? So the most common way of conflict resolution from a psychological perspective is to simply bring people together to talk, right? We call this the contact models, creating a face-to-face dialogue, which is extremely difficult, especially in areas where people are separated by walls, can't meet physically on a day-to-day basis. It's very complicated, sometimes even dangerous to meet. And oftentimes people are not willing to meet the other side. Okay, I see here. Okay. Okay, so really difficult to meet face-to-face, and here really virtual reality could potentially help. We have created these simulated face-to-face encounters, and instead of getting people to meet with the other side, they could technically, as we do it now, also talk to each other through video or chat, which would solve the logistics of getting together face-to-face, but then there is still the threshold of that we need to overcome to actually being willing to have a dialogue with the other side and hear their stories. So what we've done, and I will show you in a moment, some research on this paradigm of simulated face-to-face encounters, where we simply replace our interaction partner, we replace the other side in the conflict, and therefore facilitate such an encounter. And it's nice to talk to each other, to get to know the other side through dialogue, but I still don't know what that person is really going through. I still don't know, I haven't met them in their actual social reality. And that's another thing that VR obviously can do. In an instant, we can put people into different regions, into different places, and really get to see and experience from a first person perspective how the life of the other side looks like. And this is probably the most extreme form of perspective taking. You're probably aware of these techniques, virtual embodiment techniques, using full body tracking in virtual reality, where I can actually become the other, okay? So this is really like, instead of trying to imagine being the other, I can at least temporarily in VR be the other and experience that other person's life really through an embodied way. I would like to share with you just a few research studies that we conducted through about each of these three techniques. And we started about 7-8 years ago with an attempt to bring Jews and Arabs together in the research lab to discuss some issues about the conflict. And as psychologists, we were interested to see also their physiological responses. We also, as you can see here, we video recorded them. We tried to collect really rich data on the interaction dynamics when we interact with the enemy or the other side in the conflict. And it was almost mission impossible. It took us 4 years, and the study is still not completed, just to get people to agree to meet face to face. But we did learn a great deal on the dynamics of these encounters just by also watching the few videos that we recorded. As you can see here in this example, occasionally, and they were quite limited because we recorded their physiology and there wasn't a lot of freedom of movement, but occasionally we noticed that they imitated each other's postures. So as you can see here, both were scratching their face at the same time. And then we looked at their self-reports. We also asked them questions afterwards, and we analyzed what they were actually saying during those conversations. And we noticed the more, it was a rare occasion, but the more they imitated each other non-verbally, the more they agreed with the other, the more empathy they expressed towards the other side. So we were wondering, okay, could we technically do something like that in virtual reality, replacing the interaction partner by a virtual agent? And this is actually an experiment we designed in, when was it, 2012, 13. That was before we had access to all these current portable new VR headsets. So we used this back stereoscopic display and the shutter glasses where the character is actually appearing in front of you in a life-sized way, and then appears in 3D. So you actually do feel like you're sitting with them in the same room. And we created this interaction for Jewish Israeli participants to talk to a virtual agent representing a Palestinian. They had a conversation about a sensitive conflict issues, and we manipulated their body postures. Okay, so part of our participants were imitated their seating postures, crossing legs, arms, and so on by the virtual agent. And the other half of the participants, here you see the image of the mimicry condition, and the other half of the participants were not mimicked in a control group. And after that conversation, we also asked them to rate the level of sympathy and other psychological attributes. And we found that actually those who were mimicked by their interaction partner, the virtual interaction partner, expressed higher levels of sympathy and liking for the virtual agent, and also perceived the interaction as more harmonious, which is nice. Okay, so we see that within this simulated encounter, we can actually achieve a positive contact experience, but it went much further. So they also expressed higher levels of empathy towards the Palestinian situation in general. So this is really important, that it doesn't stay within the VR context, but that people actually change their views about the group that that virtual character represents. And quite interestingly, we found these effects for participants who reported very strong negative feelings towards Palestinians prior to the experiment. So it's possible that this was like a ceiling effect, meaning that those who were already quite open and had relatively positive feelings towards the other side, there wasn't much improvement, like room for improvement. And those who actually came in with a very negative attitude actually went through quite a big change throughout this experience. Now, what is the benefit of such a simulated encounter in virtual reality? First of all, it's a safe environment, right? There's no potential for physical harm or escalation. We have full control over it. And it's also much less anxiety provoking, right? There's this participation threshold I told you about before, that people don't usually agree to participate in a face-to-face encounter, but none of our participants had an issue to talk to a virtual character that represents the other side. And I'm not saying, by the way, that we should replace face-to-face encounters, but something like that could potentially be used as a rehearsal or as a first step to like practicing in the same safe environment an encounter with the other side. And as we have shown in this example, we can also program the interaction partner's behavior to foster a positive outcome, as exemplified here with mimicry as a means to induce or enhance empathy in an intergroup interaction. Now, this paradigm of simulated encounters has also been applied by others. Here is an example by Karim Ben Khalifa, a war photographer who produced this very interesting VR experience designed for 4 to 5 people at the same time, which I was very fortunate to experience also myself. You go in to the VR, you can actually navigate, walk through those rooms. It feels a bit like being in a museum. You encounter representatives of different sides, fronts in a conflict. In the first room, you encounter soldiers in Congo. And they appear in life-sized bodies in front of you, look you into the eyes, and as you approach them, they speak to you. They tell you their story. And these are real people that have been modeled, recorded regarding their speech, also modeled according to their real physical appearance. And then you go through different rooms, you encounter representatives of the different sides in El Salvador and also in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a Hamas soldier and an Israeli soldier. Okay, so actually, and for those who are interested to experience this yourself, there is also an augmented reality app now available that you can download on your phone and actually see those virtual characters, not in a virtual environment, but in an AR app actually appearing in your living room or wherever you try it out. And it's a quite impressive experience. So it feels a bit like they're coming to visit you and telling you about the different sides in the conflict. And kind of the conclusion from this experience is that although they're enemies, they actually have the same fears, hopes, and dreams for the future. So there is this like shared humanity in all of us. Okay. Now, what I've described so far is trying to understand the perspective of another side by talking to them or by having a simulated encounter with the other. But I would still not know how the reality of the other side actually looks like. And at least in Israel, when you try to just go for a visit to Palestine, this is the sign that you see. This road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and against Israeli law. And there are the checkpoints that prevent that people would just visit each other. Now, how could we overcome these barriers, these physical barriers of getting to meet the other side and actually visiting them in their territories? There have been a lot of these 360-degree videos produced, VR documentaries that portray conflict zones that we can't possibly go and visit because it would be too dangerous, refugee camps, maybe you know some of those documentaries, Clouds over Sidra is a very famous one, where you, in an instant, you're being put in the situation, in the location where those people live and have encounters. You can actually see their daily life and social reality. And the question we were asking in our recent studies in the lab is, what is actually the added value of seeing such a 360 video using a virtual headset in virtual reality compared to simply just watch it as a regular video on a screen, which, right, we can do both in a 360 video, either just play it on a screen or using a headset to get immersed in the scenario. And to study that question, we worked with German filmmaker Fabian Vetter, who produced a series of VR documentaries about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where he portrays individual lives and stories on each side of the conflict. And in this particular documentary, you meet Aramim, who lives in Palestine, and tells his story how his sister got killed when he was 13 by an Israeli soldier, how he first sought revenge, violent revenge, and later transformed also with much influence of his father to become a peace activist. And so a very moving story, and it's not just a simulated encounter, right? He's not an avatar, he's a real person that was filmed in a realistic environment. Actually, the filmmaker went to portray locations of his life. And what we found here, or actually what we compared here, is what are the differential impacts when people who saw this either in virtual reality or on a screen. And we're still running this study. It's not easy currently to conduct VR lab experiments. So we actually sent VR cardboard viewers to our participants' home to also, by the way, create a quite ecologically valid setting of how people would naturally look at such content. It's quite unnatural that you come to a research lab and view such documentary films, right? It's something that you would maybe do at home. And what we found there, and again, it's only a preliminary result, but we already see a very strong tendency that those who saw this 15 minutes documentary experience or expressed much higher levels of empathy compared to seeing it on the screen. And all our participants were Jewish Israelis, so they kind of met the enemy in VR and felt more empathy when they were actually immersed in the scenario. And actually, even beyond feeling empathy towards his story, we also found that those who saw it immersed in virtual reality indicated much stronger willingness to support peace-promoting policies. So, for example, they agreed that the settlement should should stop, and so on, the building of new settlements. Okay, and these were all already at such a small number of participants, already significant trends. And just one other word about these documentaries. Of course, we are a step further now. We are not just simulating an encounter, we actually get to see the environment where that individual lives. But still, I haven't been there when the Israeli soldier shot his sister, and I haven't actually experienced his daily life yet, right? How he navigates checkpoints and so on. And this is what we've done in another project. This is an acted scenario now. We created this 360-degree video that shows a confrontation between Israeli soldiers and a Palestinian couple at a military checkpoint. And this 360 video was filmed from the Palestinian point of view. And it's a 1-minute experience scenario that escalates, right? The Palestinian couple wants to cross the checkpoint because of medical emergency of the woman here. And the soldiers are very alert and try to stop them and interrogate them. And then after a minute, the situation ends in a very ambiguous way. So what we've done also with this experiment, we showed Jewish Israeli participants the scenario either using a virtual reality headset or seeing the exact same scenario on the screen as a 2D video. And we asked them first, kind of as a manipulation check, from which point of view did you see this checkpoint scenario? And I remind you, they both actually saw it from the Palestinian point of view. Okay, so it was filmed like from an over-the-shoulder angle. And those who saw it in virtual reality, as expected, most of them reported that they actually adopted the Palestinian point of view. And now, quite interestingly, when we asked those participants who saw it as a 2D video on a screen, from which point of view do you think you perceived this scenario? You see here, they more often felt like a bystander, although it was the exact same point of view and camera perspective. Now, this already shows in a very kind of technical way how VR is actually able or facilitates the adoption of the intended point of view. Okay, so in the condition where they saw the video on a screen, they felt as a bystander, kind of as an outside observer, whereas in the immersive VR experience, they actually felt immersed in the scenario and felt being immersed also in the point of view of the Palestinians. And here, interestingly, we didn't find a difference between the 360 VR experience and the 2D video experience regarding empathy towards the Palestinian couple. And there were also quite a few other like media comparison studies that didn't find this expected empathy effect. So VR has always been claimed to be the ultimate empathy machine, but there are quite a few studies that show that this is not always the case. So we really need to think also how such VR experiences actually need to be produced to provoke empathy. At least here, if that would have been the goal of this particular experience, we could have concluded that it doesn't actually matter if you see it in VR or as a 2D video on a screen. At least in terms of empathy, we would have achieved the same results. However, what we did find was that when Jewish Israeli participants saw this scenario in virtual reality, they judged the actions of the Israeli soldiers as significantly less justified and less moral than when they saw it as a 2D video on a screen. And this was actually explained not because they empathized more in the VR condition with the Palestinians, but because they felt more hostile emotions towards the soldiers. Okay, so now this is interesting because usually our Israeli participants, most of them have also been to the Israeli army and actually experienced such scenarios, most likely from the soldiers' point of view. Now, just for a minute, adopting the point of view of such an encounter at a checkpoint from the Palestinian side, and the experience, the aggression of an Israeli soldier, develop more hostile emotions, meaning more anger, disgust, and contempt towards their action, which led to a reduction in their moral justification of their own group's actions. And this is actually also a very interesting path towards conflict resolution, to change the way people think about what their own group is doing in a conflict, which is also quite a new approach and the great potential to use VR for. And we also see this evidence by the physiological arousal. We also recorded physiology during this experiment, and we see here already on the graph that the VR condition, those who were immersed in the scenario in virtual reality, responded much stronger in terms of their emotional physiological arousal. So really having a gun pointed towards you in VR is certainly a much more arousing experience than seeing the same thing on a computer screen in a 2D video. And now in the next study, what we did there, we compared, or we wanted to see how we could change using a very simple cinematographic technique, just changing the camera perspective, where to place the position of the camera in an immersive 360 video, and how that would affect the psychological responses to it. So we filmed this scenario again, right? Once we already have the point of view of the Palestinians, we also created point of view of the Israeli soldiers. And this time, both conditions or both groups of participants actually saw it in virtual reality. Just the only difference was the exact same scenario. The only difference was whether they saw it from the Palestinian or the soldiers' point of view. And here we found actually that Israeli participants who saw the checkpoint scenario from the Palestinian point of view expressed more empathy, significantly more empathy towards the Palestinian couple than when they saw it from the soldiers' point of view. But even more interesting, we find that even 6 months later, this was a 1 minute VR experience for many participants, by the way, the first time they experienced VR. And 6 months later, we conducted a survey which was sent by people that they didn't know, that were independent from the previous VR experiment. We asked them about then recent real life conflict event, and asked them to judge the moral actions of an Israeli soldier in that event. And we saw that those who saw 6 months earlier this checkpoint scenario in VR from the Palestinian point of view condemned the Israeli soldiers' moral transgression in this real-life conflict event to a much significantly severe level than when they saw it from their usual Israeli point of view. So now this just to illustrate how changing viewpoints and simulating encounters can be really an interesting way to use VR for, and there's really a lot of potential to explore. And now I want to just mention in the remaining, let's say 15 minutes, I think I have left, another way to achieve perspective taking, which is probably the most extreme way, using virtual embodiment, right? I guess some of you might be familiar with this technique, recording, tracking participants' body movements and mapping in real time their movements onto an avatar that moves in synchrony with their real body movements. So when people are in virtual reality, when they look down at themselves, they see this virtual body that replaces their physical body, and they also see, usually there's a virtual mirror in these experiences where they see the reflection of the virtual body instead of the real body. And so this paradigm of body ownership or virtual embodiment really invites also to test what happens if we are embodied in a virtual body that doesn't look like our real physical appearance, but if that virtual body is like representing another group. For example, if I'm a white person, how would that be if I see myself in a black virtual body all of a sudden? And this is actually an experiment I conducted at the University of Barcelona a couple of years ago in Mel Slater's lab, who is doing research also on the psychological effects of virtual reality. And I'll just show you quickly in a video how that looked like. So here we put light-skinned female participants either in a dark-skinned virtual body or in a light-skinned virtual body. In the beginning, they got familiar to the virtual appearance, and then they interacted with another character that appeared next to them, which was either a white or a black character, not controlled by another real human participant, but fully automated pre-programmed character. They took turns describing images that appeared on the wall. We didn't actually care what they said about the images. What we were interested in seeing was whether our participants in the white or in the black virtual body would imitate the person next to them to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the skin color of their interaction partner. So each of our participants interacted twice, once with a white and once with a black virtual character. And what we see here, that if and all our participants were light-skinned, if they were being put in a light-skinned virtual body, we see a much greater amount of mimicry of another white character, which is actually what we would expect to find in a face-to-face interaction, right? We are known to mimic, to imitate people who are similar to us, who belong to the same race, to the same ethnic groups, and so on. So it's actually nice to see that it also works in VR with digital characters, and not only face-to-face, but it's not further surprising that we find greater amounts of mimicry in white compared to black interaction. Now, what's interesting to see when we put white participants into a black virtual body, all of a sudden the image is reversed. So they imitate another black character to a greater extent than another white character. So this is interesting because in an instant, I treat my new in-group. If I'm in a black body, I treat another black person as my in-group and show more mimicry, which is actually a very rudimentary form of empathy. So we know that the more we mimic, also the more we empathize with the other. So this is really what we call the reverse in-group bias effect. And it has also been shown in many other studies that such virtual race transformations can actually reduce racial prejudice. And it's not that easy. There has also been studies showing it really depends on the context in which such an interaction takes place. It can also backfire and increase racial prejudice, even if it's not designed in a suitable way. Now, if we apply this technique, or I was wondering, could we also use this in the context of violent intergroup conflict? So technically, we could create virtual bodies of Jews and Arabs and use these stereotypical visual symbols, religious symbols, visualizing the interaction partners. But if we're trying actually to reduce stereotypes, so this would maybe not be the way to go. I mean, all these like virtual body transformations work really nicely if there is an obvious visual difference, like being put in an old or young virtual body, in the body of another gender, another race, body size, weight. But if the groups in conflict don't actually visually differ so much, we have a bit of a problem there. I mean, there are still differences that we can emphasize, but maybe not in the visual appearance. But the more important actually point that prevented us to go further with this idea of embodying the enemy in a violent conflict was that it can really potentially lead to negative responses. Imagine individuals who hold very strong negative feelings towards the other side. All of a sudden they look into a mirror and they see themselves in the body of another, of the other side in conflict, in a representative of the group that they feel very negatively towards. So again, it might be possible. We actually haven't tried it yet, but we would really need to carefully think how to design such an experience, how to make this transition in order to create positive and beneficial effect. But meanwhile, we were thinking of alternative approaches. Could we still exploit this power, this really profound psychological impact of changing our body appearance? Could we still make use of this technique, but without actually directly confronting participants with the outgroup or with the conflict itself? So what we then found at the time was public opinion surveys over the past 25 years in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we found that over the past 25 years, whenever a representative sample of the Jewish Israeli population was asked what they think the chances are that there will be peace in the future, we see, and you see here in this graph, that the older generations are always more hopeful, more optimistic that the conflict can be resolved compared to the younger generation. And also, actually, there is a significant increase in this gap. So the young people, the young generations are constantly losing more and more hope in that there will be peace in the future. So we thought, okay, so if we are quite naturally becoming more hopeful as we grow older, we could either just wait until we're all 80 and become more optimistic that there can be a resolution for the conflict, or we could give young people, young Jewish Israelis, a virtual experience of being old. So we put about 70 Jewish Israeli participants in a virtual body of an 80-year-old. Here we use a new 360 video-based technique to induce body ownership over the body of an 80-year-old. And in a control group, we used a body of their own age. They were all in their mid-20s. And so we wanted to see whether such an experience of being old for 3 minutes in virtual reality could potentially also induce hope in the young generation. I'll show you, before I show you the results, I'll show you quickly a video.
Now open your eyes.
How this experience looked like.
Let's continue. Hi, look at your hands. I'm going to tap on your fingers for about half a minute.
So you see here, since it was a new technique using 360 video, there is no agency actually. People weren't able to move their virtual body, which we can do when it's a synthetic body and we have body tracking. Here was a rather passive experience. So we had, instead of creating this visual motor synchrony with the virtual body, we had a visual tactile stimulation, similar to what we use in the rubber hand illusion. Maybe you're familiar with that one. So there was a live performer that actually performed the movements and touch that participants saw in the virtual reality with the real hands of the participants. So they moved them into the positions, gave them something to hold. So it was, in a way, a passive agency that we created. So it wasn't a stiff experience in that sense, although participants weren't supposed to self-initiate body movements or hand movements. It was an experience that involved synchronous touch and movements, and there was also this narrative layer that explained or gave some context of being old. So yes, so in this, I think you understand. So in this experience, people were either embodied in the old virtual body or in a virtual body of their own age. And as I said before, the VR experience itself had nothing to do with the conflict. We didn't talk about the other side in the conflict or the conflict itself. It was simply experiencing being old for 3 minutes. And afterwards, we gave them a questionnaire, and among many other questions about the experience, we asked them how hopeful they are about the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And indeed, we found that those who were in the virtual old body expressed significantly more hope for peace than those who were in the control group embodied in the same age as their own. now this really illustrates also the transformative potential of virtual reality. And I hope I was able to illustrate really how, I mean, of course, these are only preliminary findings. We've only just in recent years started to explore this potential of VR for conflict resolution. But I think the examples really show that there is a potential, that VR can be a potential tool for conflict resolution and really lead to profound changes in people's mindsets towards a more peace-promoting attitudes and emotions in the context of violent intergroup conflicts. And this is really still widely unexplored application of VR. And of course, there are also potential risks that we must assess to ensure that it is an effective and ethical application in peace-building programs. There's also research showing, for example, that sometimes it can also be too immersive, too explicit, and we want to prevent inducing threat and anxiety in participants, but rather design a positive and maybe transformative experience. And also, I think it's important to point out here that VR is not a magic tool that can be potentially a standalone application that I would just give a VR experience to people and they would come out changed. It needs to be embedded in and carefully integrated into existing peace-building practices. I think we cannot just give this to people and leave them alone, and there needs to be a discussion around it, and also a way to, let's say I encountered the other side in VR, so what's the next step? You also need to provide opportunities to further engage. So I think, yes, this is it from my side. Thank you all very much for your attention. We might have time for questions. How does this work in this format? Are there questions from the audience?